Jake Reiner thought this Christmas would finally feel like coming home. After years of distance, busy schedules, quiet gaps in phone calls, a family that learned to survive around one fragile orbit, he had planned the return like a vow. One table, two parents. The old Brentwood house that still smelled in memory of laughter and classic films of Carl Reiner's stories floating through rooms as casually as dinner conversation. Jake pictured himself walking in with small belated gifts, a steadier career, a few hard-won roles, proof that he had found a place of his own under a... Then came the night of December 14. It didn't arrive with public chaos or flashing headlines, just a brief phone call that turned time into a cold edge. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were found dead inside their own home. Not an accident. Not a sudden illness. A violent end, multiple stab wounds to the neck and chest, so immediate it erased every future sentence Jake meant to say. And the most horrifying detail followed almost instantly: the name. Nick Reiner. The younger brother Jake once protected, once excused, once loved with the exhausted loyalty of an eldest child who learned to step back so everyone else could breathe. When Jake finally spoke, he didn't offer a tidy explanation. He offered a crack in the family's foundation. I warned them. 3 months earlier, when Nick wanted to move back in, Jake had begged his parents to set boundaries, to be careful to listen, not for his sake but for theirs. He feared the one thing you can't undo. December 17 showed everything again. Now the warning wasn't a warning anymore. It was a bruise that had turned into a headline, a home that had turned into a crime scene, and a Christmas that would never come. December 17 arrived with a silence heavier than sirens. Los Angeles moved as it always did, traffic humming, cameras flashing, but two parallel scenes unfolded miles apart. On one side of the city, Nick Reiner climbed the cold stone steps of a courthouse. Each step echoed with restraint, the kind imposed by handcuffs, schedules, and law. On the other side, Jake Reiner sat beneath studio lights at KCBS, the place that had once felt safer than home. The lights flattened his face, making the hollows beneath his eyes deeper, his skin thinner. Sleep had abandoned him. A dark suit clung to his tall frame shoulders, slightly hunched, as if years of unsaid things had finally found weight. His hands were clasped on the desk, fingers locked together so tightly his knuckles drained of color. Jake straightened his back when the camera went live. He had done this hundreds of times before. He knew where to look, when to pause, how to let a sentence breathe. Yet that night every habit betrayed him. His voice stayed low, measured as though each word had to push past something tightened in his throat. "I have sat here through so many long nights," he said slowly, "but never one like tonight." Outside the studio, December air pressed against courthouse walls. Nick moved forward without looking back, guided by procedure rather than choice. The distance between the brothers was no longer measured in years or arguments, but in roles they had not chosen. One was being processed. The other was being watched. Jake did not speak as a witness to events. He spoke as someone who understood exactly how stories solidify once spoken aloud. He had built his life believing that standing behind the narrative would keep him untouched. Journalism was supposed to be armor. Distance was supposed to protect. That illusion dissolved under the lights. He was no longer reporting a tragedy. He was standing inside it, exposed, knowing that some warnings arrived too early to be believed and too late to forgive. The silence that followed felt permanent and heavier than any verdict. Long before December, long before warnings and sirens, Jake Reiner learned how to disappear without leaving the room. He grew up inside a house filled with laughter. Stories floated through the living room the way other families passed salt at dinner. His grandfather, Carl Reiner, was always present, films, playing jokes, unfolding creativity treated as something ordinary, almost casual. To outsiders it looked like a childhood wrapped in warmth and privilege. But Jake carried the Reiner name like an oversized coat. It fit loosely at first, then grew heavier with every year. People smiled when they heard it. Doors opened, expectations followed. From a young age, he understood that the name belonged to something larger than him. Jake was the eldest. That fact shaped everything. When toys were limited, he gave them up. When space was tight, he stepped back. When tension rose, he learned to stay quiet. Nick was smaller, weaker, more fragile. "He's still little," Jake heard again and again. And so Jake became the one who endured. The one who adjusted. The one who didn't need attention because someone else needed it more. No one ever asked if Jake was fine. He learned to answer before the question arrived. "I'm fine," he would say, even when no one had asked. Silence became his instinct. Not because he lacked feelings, but because expressing them felt unnecessary, even disruptive. In that house, stability was valuable. Jake became the place where instability could lean without falling apart. His parents loved deeply. Rob Reiner was present, proud, affectionate in his own steady way. Michelle Singer Reiner watched everything closely, her photographer's eye always alert, quietly preserving moments, the way others collect proof. Jake understood their love. He never doubted it. But love was unevenly distributed by need. Nick needed more. Nick demanded more. Nick absorbed the gravity of the room. Jake learned to comfort himself in corners. He learned to swallow resentment before it formed words. He learned that being the oldest did not mean being protected. It meant protecting everyone else. That habit followed him into adulthood, into his career, into the way he spoke, and more importantly, into the way he warned. By the time Jake finally said he was afraid he had already spent a lifetime being the one who never was. Before everything narrowed into fear, there were rituals that felt permanent. Baseball stitched 3 generations together long before it became a refuge. Carl had loved the game, Rob carried it with reverence, and Jake inherited it as something steadier than conversation. Rob took Jake to Dodger Stadium dozens of times each season. They sat shoulder to shoulder under the California sun, keeping score, sharing silences that did not need explanation. Once on a trip to Cooperstown, Rob stood inside the Hall of Fame and cried not from nostalgia but from the simple relief of being a father watching his son grow. Those afternoons mattered because they were uncomplicated. They belonged to a version of the family that did not yet live in emergency. Later, when distance grew, Jake clung to the game another way, co-hosting a Dodgers podcast with friends, talking trades and innings as if continuity could be spoken into place. Michelle watched all of it through a different lens. A photographer by instinct and by trade, she recorded life quietly, framing moments without interrupting them. Birthdays, dinners, small triumphs, she gathered them as if memory might need proof someday. To Jake, she felt like an invisible camera, always present, always observing, never demanding. Then the rhythms changed. Phone calls began to interrupt dinners. Nights stretched longer. Hope arrived in cycles, each promise followed by a careful exhale, then disappointment. The warmth of baseball seasons gave way to the vigilance of waiting. Rob's laughter thinned. Michelle listened for footsteps, for doors, for any sound that meant her son was still alive. Jake watched the house convert itself into a shelter. Love hardened into endurance. The past did not disappear, but it retreated, becoming something they looked back on to remember who they had been. Those memories did not save them. They only made the present sharper, a reminder that once this family knew how to breathe without counting each inhale. What followed would test every habit Jake had learned, forcing silence into speech, memory into warning, and love into a boundary he never wanted to draw before the calendar closed forever. When Nick Reiner began struggling with addiction at 15, it did not announce itself as catastrophe. It arrived in fragments, glazed eyes, sudden anger nights that stretched without explanation. Jake noticed first, not because he was wiser, but because he had been trained to watch quietly. Promises followed. Rehabilitation apologies, the vow that this time would be different. Each return home carried hope like a fragile glass, handled carefully, afraid of the sound it would make if dropped. Rob believed in patience. Michelle believed in presence. Nick's descent was not linear. There were stretches of calm dinners where his hands shook, less conversations that sounded almost normal. Then the crashes returned. Disappearances. Explosive moods. Years blurred into a cycle the family learned to anticipate. At times, Nick had nowhere to go. Homelessness became another chapter no one wanted to name out loud. Addiction hardened him. The darkness inside grew louder, less predictable. Jake watched fear replacing denial, understanding that love alone could not restrain what was forming. Rob and Michelle entered survival mode without realizing when it began. Every phone call carried dread. Every quiet hour felt temporary. Michelle waited, listening for proof of breath. Rob placed himself between his sons when tempers flared, repeating the same sentence like a prayer. "We have to save him." The words returned again and again, softening boundaries each time they were spoken. Nick was not treated as a danger, but as a responsibility. Forgiveness replaced limits. Hope replaced caution. The house adjusted around his volatility. Jake felt the shift before anyone named it. He loved his brother, but he was no longer blind to risk. Threats did not need fists to be real. Rage carried momentum. Patterns once ignored began to look like warnings waiting to be heard. The family grew accustomed to overlooking small alarms. Broken objects were explained away. Raised voices were reframed as stress. Each concession felt compassionate, yet each one trained everyone to accept more instability than before. By the time Nick spoke about starting over, the promises sounded familiar, almost rehearsed. Jake wanted to believe, yet fear sat heavier than hope. Watching his parents age under the strain, he understood that rescuing someone repeatedly does not restore them. It exhausts everyone else. Jake saw the danger approaching long before the house was ready to admit it. The role he had practiced since childhood returned, reshaped. This time, silence felt like betrayal. Love demanded speech. The warning was coming whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. What followed would test every belief his parents held about compassion and every instinct Jake had learned about restraint. The cycle had reached its limit. The next step would force a choice no one wanted to make, and consequences no one believed were possible. In the background, calendars kept turning unaware. 3 months remained. Enough time to speak, enough time to listen. Not enough time, as it would become clear to undo what had already been set in motion by then, alone. 3 months before December, Nick asked to come home. The request sounded ordinary, almost reasonable. A roof, a familiar couch, a chance to start again. Rob and Michelle heard a son asking for mercy. Jake heard something else entirely. He felt it immediately, a tightening in his chest that refused to be calmed by hope. He called his parents the moment he learned Nick wanted to move back in. His voice was urgent, stripped of jokes and patience. He did not argue about the past. He did not accuse. He warned. Jake told them he did not feel safe. He spoke about Nick's years on the streets, the severity of the addiction, the volatility that surfaced without warning. He said he was afraid of something irreversible, the kind of mistake that does not leave room for apologies. Rob listened, but answered with the same quiet conviction he had carried for years. Nick was their son. Family stayed together. Love, he believed, could still be the net that caught him. Michelle echoed that faith, promising supervision, boundaries, watchfulness. They had done this before. They believed they could do it again. Jake tried once more. He described the anger he had seen, the way it moved faster than reason. He asked them, not for his sake, but for theirs, to be careful. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten distance. He asked them to listen. They did not. What followed was not surprise. It was confirmation. Jake had lived long enough inside that family to recognize the pattern. Nick's needs always weighed more. Jake's fears had learned to wait their turn. The most painful truth was not that his parents disagreed. It was that he understood why. They loved Nick with the desperation of people terrified of losing a child. They chose hope because hope was the only thing that allowed them to keep breathing. Jake ended the call knowing he had done what he could. He did not believe his words had changed anything. He carried that certainty with him, heavy but familiar. Later, when the warning returned as reality, he would not ask why they hadn't listened. He already knew. He loved his brother, and he was afraid of his brother. Both things were true, and neither could cancel the other. 3 months passed quietly. The danger did not announce itself. It waited. Without warning, the calendar turned.
The call came after the arrest. Jake recognized the number before he answered. He stared at the screen longer than he meant to, as if delaying the inevitable could still change its shape. When he finally picked up, Nick's voice rushed forward, hoarse and frantic, words stumbling over each other without pause. Nick said it wasn't what people were saying. He said things had spiraled, that everything had gone wrong too fast. He said Jake was the only one he had left. The desperation was raw, stripped of anger, replaced by panic. Then came the number. $4 million. Bail, Nick said. The only way out. The last rope before everything closed in. He begged Jake to help, to use whatever influence or resources remained, to pull him back from behind the walls, now closing around him. He said he couldn't survive in there. He said this was the one time he needed saving. Jake listened without interrupting. His grip tightened around the phone until his hand began to shake. Images flooded in, uninvited. His parents' faces, the house that would never be filled again, the warnings that had arrived too early and now felt unbearably late. When Jake finally spoke, his voice was low. "I can't." The words fell slowly, heavier than he expected. On the other end of the line, silence shattered into rage. Nick accused him of betrayal, of abandonment, of being no different from everyone else who had walked away. Jake closed his eyes as tears rose, uninvited and relentless. "I'm not abandoning you," he said, his voice breaking, "but I can't save you this way." The call ended abruptly, leaving only the hollow sound of disconnected air. Jake lowered the phone and sat still. His hands trembled. His chest felt empty, as if something essential had been cut loose. There was no relief. No sense of righteousness, only collapse. "I can't" was not strength. It was the boundary he had never been allowed to draw before. It marked the end of the role he had carried since childhood, the one who absorbed, endured, and repaired. That night, Jake understood that some decisions feel like survival and loss at the same time, and that love, once stretched beyond its limits, can no longer save anyone, least of all the person forced to say no.
After the call ended, the rage arrived late, slow, and quiet enough to feel dangerous. It did not explode outward. It folded inward as the same truth returned. He hated what had been done and what had been taken, but beneath that hatred was something worse. The person responsible was still his brother. Blood did not dissolve because of violence. It only made the aftermath heavier and harder to name. The questions came next, each one offering the illusion of control before collapsing. If he had flown home sooner, would anything have changed? If he had spoken louder, refused to accept silence, pushed harder for boundaries, would his parents have chosen differently? Every imagined version of the past ended the same way, with Jake confronting the limits of what he could do. Regret became a loop replaying itself without mercy. When Jake returned to Los Angeles, Romy was waiting. There were no speeches, only the need to hold on to the one person who could feel the fracture from the inside. They held each other in silence, standing still as if movement might break whatever remained. In that moment, it was breath, tears, and the shared understanding that their family no longer existed in any recognizable form. Jake had planned to come home for Christmas. He had rehearsed it in his mind, stepping into the old living room, placing his achievements on the table like belated gifts, hearing his father's quiet nod of pride, feeling his mother's hand reach for his. That scene never came. The chairs stayed empty, the house stayed silent, and the future he imagined dissolved overnight. Sleep brought no relief. Nightmares returned sharp and repetitive, and the calendar became an enemy in its precision. 3 months, just 3 months ago, he had said everything he knew how to say. He had seen the danger coming, and still it happened. Some wounds do not close because they are not meant to heal. They remain as proof of what was loved, what was lost, and what could not be saved, even when it was seen in advance in the clearest possible way. After the broadcast ended, many viewers stayed seated in silence. Some turned off their televisions halfway through, only to turn them back on minutes later, caught between discomfort and the need to witness what was unfolding. This was not outraged television, not spectacle. It felt private, almost intrusive, as if the camera had slipped into a room it was never meant to enter. Online reactions arrived in fragments rather than arguments. "I couldn't breathe after watching this. He wasn't a reporter anymore. He was a son." People who had never known the Reiner family admitted they cried anyway. Others described an unfamiliar guilt, the sense that they had witnessed something too raw to be consumed, like ordinary news. That night, the story escaped the screen. Viewers called parents they hadn't spoken to in months. Siblings checked in without explaining why. People held their families a little tighter, unsettled by the reminder that the safest places can still collapse without warning. Jake's grief stopped belonging only to him. It touched a fear many recognized but rarely named, that love, patience, and good intentions are not always enough to keep a home from becoming a crime scene. No one slept easily afterward. Jake did not speak that night to seek attention or absolution. He spoke because silence had become heavier than the truth, and because living with an unspoken warning felt like betrayal. He understood that nothing he said could restore what was gone, but saying nothing would mean accepting that the lesson died with his parents. What remained was not certainty, but a boundary drawn too late to save anyone and too painful to ignore. Jake no longer believed in the comfort of "if only." He had warned, he had tried, and the collapse taught him that foresight does not guarantee prevention. His story ends without resolution because some losses do not offer one. Families require more than devotion. They require listening, clarity, and the courage to confront signs that feel unbearable to face. There are mistakes that allow no second chance, and moments when the right words arrive before anyone is ready to hear them for everyone. The Christmas Jake imagined never came. What remains instead is a question left unanswered, one that lingers after the screen goes dark. If they had listened that day, would anything have been different, or was the warning only meant to survive as proof?